Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are. We're going to give it a couple minutes just to let everybody join and get started. So I'm going to throw a poll up, starting to get some responses in. So looks like the majority of people are interested in all of the above, which is good because we will spend time talking about everything on today's agenda. And then it's pretty evenly split between aligning teams and stakeholders, managing with limited resources, making trade-off decisions, and shaping teams to enable growth. So just a little bit about Dragonboat. For you, those of you that don't know, we're a product portfolio platform with a mission to empower outcome-focused teams. We've been adopted by 1,000 teams in over 20 countries. And we just had some exciting news this week. We just announced a $12 million A round with Insight Partners. And that means more product features, functionality, and a greater community for the empowered product teams within our network. So switching over to the speakers for today, excited to introduce Becky Flint, who's the founder and CEO of Dragonboat. Prior to Dragonboat, Becky built product ops and portfolio management for companies like PayPal, BigCommerce, Shutterfly, and Feedzai. Sridhar is a business and product leader with global experience in e-commerce, payments, and SaaS, and a track record of delivering delightful products across multiple markets. Sridhar is the VP of product at Chatmeter and heads up product design and analytics and scaling the team for growth. So with that, I'll stop talking and pass it over to the speakers for today.
Hi, thank you, Baji. I'm really excited to be here, everyone, and great to connect with you, Sridhar. Just fun facts you probably noticed. Sridhar and I actually worked together for quite a bit of time a while back and did a lot of fun things at PayPal. And he is leading product at an amazing company called Chatmeter. So I will hand it over to you, Sridhar. Tell us a little bit of Chatmeter and what's exciting in your area.
Yeah, so thank you, first of all, Becky and Baji, for inviting me to participate. Super excited to be here, and congrats again on your fundraise. It's always good to get validation externally and from investors on product market fit. So that's awesome to hear. Just a little bit about me and a little bit about Chatmeter. So as Baji mentioned, I've been doing product at various different places over the last couple of decades, and Becky and I spent many years together at PayPal, where we actually did some pretty cool projects, including the launch of PayPal Australia, which I thought was one of our crowning glories. So it was we had some fun times there. So what does Chatmeter do? So Chatmeter is a far cry from PayPal. Moved all the way from fintech to in MarTech. And we're an online reputation management company. And what we focus on essentially is how do we help brick and mortar businesses, especially large multi-location brands, drive online traffic to their store. And we do that by providing these brands with local insights and solutions. The world, despite the massive drive towards e-commerce and online shopping, there's a significant chunk of close to probably 85% of total commerce is still offline, and lots of these brick and mortar stores need to differentiate themselves and to be able to get those people into their stores, especially now in light of the pandemic. It's becoming more and more important to do so. So that's what we do. We provide these insights and solutions to these businesses in three ways. One is to ensure brand alignment. We establish what's called brand consistency by fostering localized experiences for the brand, increasing customer acquisition. So it's making it easy for consumers to discover these brands over the competition. and providing an optimized and accurate online experience to drive prospects to make decisions about the business. And finally, improving the customer experience. And this is becoming kind of like a mantra all over the place, where seamless customer journey from search to purchase and everything in between. So that's sort of what we do. And yeah, we're excited to participate in this.
Thank you so much, and I really appreciate it to share the context. It's interesting where, like you mentioned, in the time when we worked together at PayPal, mostly when we started was mostly just an online experience, and then over time I realized the online, offline, the multi-channel is so essential, and it's great to see you take the things that PayPal and then later on of enabling small to larger merchants in different channels, like from row to row. So it's really fun to see that. So I know today we want to talk a little bit more around scaling products. We've gone through different scaling journeys, and some of the topics around scaling product really is around the team, the stakeholders, and trade-off and resources. So we're just gonna kind of sort of touch upon all of them around sort of the areas. So maybe we can get started on talking about teams. And before we started the session, we actually talked a little bit about how the structure of the team, how the way we work of teams definitely have gone through tremendous change. Even when we were at PayPal, when we were leading global expansion, by default working with the people in all locations, but it's different from what it is today. So share a little bit with us on when you build team as you're scaling Chatmeter and other companies, what are the key challenges and the things that you learn are helpful to the other companies out there to think about their teams and structures and growth?
Yeah, it's things have definitely changed, and I think things have changed materially over the last 2 years. Since the pandemic, and the idea of A, building teams, and then B, scaling them has sort of evolved and morphed over time. And the one thing that has remained fairly consistent, though, over the course of whether we were at PayPal, where we were a much larger company, or at a smaller organization where I am right now at Chatmeter, is building a culture of collaboration and collaboration across not just the product function, but across all functions. So that's super important because, and it's becoming more and more important now because we're not in the same room and solving problems on a whiteboard all the time. While that happens once in a while, it's not always the way the problems are solved today. So having that culture of collaboration from day one, I think, is quite important. And as companies scale, that's the one thing that typically drops off. While the intentions are always positive and people always want to be collaborative, it's not that that people are necessarily averse to it, but it just becomes more subconscious, right? You're sort of like, oh, I sent an email, so I guess things happened and or actions are getting taken, or I sent a Slack message and something happened. While that is true, I think it also leads to a lot more tactical focus, and you end up sort of resulting in the immediate, in like what needs to happen now, what needs to happen the next hour and the next day, as opposed to balancing that with what needs to happen in the longer term. So, and in order to have effective growth and scale teams, you need to look at a balance of the two, which leads to the second part of this. So how do you sort of then plan for this? And it reminds me of a very kind of quote that sort of sticks in my mind. And I kind of have seen it attributed to a lot of people, but I think it was originally by Lord Kelvin, and then Peter Drucker, and then John Deming. But essentially what it says is, if you cannot measure it, you cannot improve it. I mean, it's not a new quote. It's just that's what it is. I mean, the reality is when Lord Kelvin back 200 years ago, when he was, doing chemistry and working on the gas law, great. I mean, that's fantastic. But he needed to measure it. And in science, it's very obvious. But it's harder to do that when it comes to building teams and scaling for growth. So one thing I found fairly effective is making sure that the teams, as they grow, have a fundamental set of KPIs that everyone's marching towards and measuring. Right. And the team itself is not just at the product level, but everything needs to sort of roll up, right? So you have the situation where you have the product team, and then that then relates to the business metrics, and then to the corporate metrics, and so on and so forth. So I think that's a good way to start. I can talk more about it, but I think you got a question.
Yeah, that's actually, you touched upon so many very interesting topics. So I'm just going to dissect and then pick some of them specifically. I think could be very interesting to some of our audience, and also just very interesting for my experiences when I just chat with you. The interesting thing, one of them is that even though we were distributed, and then we were actually working differently in the context distributed, meaning that you have sort of the capabilities in group, and then you have another capabilities in another location. So it's almost like the APIs of components that they're talking to each other has a lot less. You have more defined sort of the function, and then you just use the API to work with the function. Today, like not only the functions, say not like in the past, for example, we work at a PayPal, we had like a product managers in one location primarily with all the other PMs, and some engineers in one location, some engineer in the other location, and then we have a business partners, let's say in another country. So we do have like sort of distinctive sort of the connection points, and it's less frequent because the PMs work a lot closer and every day working together. So in this today's environment, what you mentioned is like, not just COVID, even like slightly before COVID, we already start to have like a PMs in multiple locations, engineers in multiple locations, so that the API model doesn't work anymore. You can't just do like end of day in sync or just once a time in sync. So I want to just kind of go back to you on that, because what I noticed is that when that happened, the people were trying to reduce complexity. Then they just created a quote unquote agile team, a scrum team, a pod. So the pod started to have a relatively smaller number of communication, right? You have a product manager, maybe a designer, a couple of engineers, and then you work in that pod, and then you have relatively less interaction with the rest of the company or other pods, just because that it's more convenient, right? But that obviously leading to some other problems. So we have seen is that one is the pod may shrink and expand in need. Like in this pod, let's say, owns certain areas of product. That areas of product sometimes needs a lot more work, sometimes needs less work. And similarly to the other pods. So then you become a little bit challenged because there's no way to have both the visibility and the juggling between them. So how's your experience on this topic, and how do you manage them?
So there's no simple answer to it, but I think it also depends on how the product platform is structured, and it makes it easier if the platform is sort of pod friendly, right? I mean, as we were at PayPal, we were a fairly evolved platform where we could sort of say, hey, risk, merchant services, consumer, working on relatively independent pieces of the business and the code and the process, and they really interfaced in minimal amounts. And while in a smaller organization, that isn't always the case. We're in a situation where platforms aren't that well defined, and it's also you're not dealing with such big teams, and the pods, while they are technically independent, more often than not, they need to spend a lot more time collaborating. And I think it's important here and I hate to use the word process, but I think at some point in time, every single company goes through this aha moment, and you sort of go, well, process isn't a bad word, right? I mean, it's an important part of growth, and it doesn't have to be heavy. It doesn't have to be sort of burdensome to the organization and to the way the organization works, but it's important. It's very, very important. And now, I mean, there are tools that are available today. I mean, Dragonboat's a great example of such a tool, which is available today to help with this process without making it burdensome. And going back to this idea of, whether you have 2 or 3 Scrum teams and each of them working together, the way we do it is, we typically do planning, technically, yes, at an annual level, but it's super high level. It's like, hey, what do we think we should be focused on? And we have some very high level plans. And then we look at quarterly is when we start looking at, okay, well, let's look 1 quarter ahead and really start diving into, what we need to actually build, and assigning the work to, well, can it be done by pod A or pod B or team A or team B, and then at what point do the teams need to come together, and building that collaborativeness into that process so that everyone's aware of, hey, you know what, if I'm working on the social module, and there may be some interfaces to the reputation module. Okay, well, great. When that happens, I need to pull that team in, and there may be some work that gets injected here or there. So it is super important to sort of keep that in mind, and having tools that sort of clearly allow you to sort of plan and sort of say, hey, you know what? I've got 6 initiatives. I've broken it down to enough detail, and I know which pod's going to be working on it, which team's going to be working on it. I know when that's going to happen. And then I know, for example, when to pull the teams in without sort of making it burdensome and saying, well, you need to write this doc and that doc, and you need to get it signed off and approved and so on. So I think having that flexibility with tools is super important.
Right, and I think what you said is so true. Obviously, Dragonboat came into the word is because we're facing these problems, and then that's how we ultimately solving the problems with both the people and technology. And obviously, tooling is a part of the technology side of things. So yeah, I really like. I definitely have been to an environment where that. Because it's so difficult to communicate and collaborate and team in different locations. So they've broken things into pods, and then they were so independently operating, and then they don't have a good way to collaborate together. Then you have this like, one is like an org chart, right, written over the product, right? You can clearly see this is written this way by a different one because the look and feel, just little nuances not connect together. And the other part is you create a lot of tech debt, because in the ideal world, I want to work with this team to get things together, but because we didn't align the direction and roadmap and priority, and we couldn't get their support because they have their focus, then we end up just work around our code and write a bunch of stuff and try to make it happen. So over time, become a not only just a better user experience because the org chart all over, also it's just not the tech debt over time just really like people don't realize tech debt is. And people don't realize tech debt a lot of times is a product induced, not really engineering induced, right? It's called a tech debt, but it's really product decision leading to it.
Yes, and it's usually introduced by the need for speed, right? It's like, well, and this is the whole, again, going back to this question around how do you sort of build, so we introducing process to solve very specific challenges rather than for process's sake, right? So I think that's super important, because ultimately, when you're small, and most companies now, most startups and even upstarts or scale-ups, we all work agile. But what agile allows you to do and enables you to do is exactly what you said. It's like, well, it's all about testing and learning. Everyone from the board down to the product manager wants, it's like, hey, let's test and learn and see if it works. And then you're right, that's how you introduce tech debt, because it's like, well, it's just a test. Well, let's just figure out how to get this test out there. And we're like, well, do you really want to spend, 4 sprints building this hook, or do I want to spend 3 days just building a workaround? And then you have this over and over again, and you go, oh, you know what? This actually worked. Now let's iterate, let's grow it. So every time you test and learn and iterate, and then all of a sudden you have a product, and you find you have fit, but then you realize you also have a mountain of debt.
Right.
And yes, absolutely. I think that's the one thing that I think a big distinction between a startup and as a company that's a bit further along in its maturity is we can't afford to introduce that much debt. We've got to be careful about it and plan for it.
I think you're spot on. So we have a live audience question around that. Madeline is on a fast growing startup product team, and they're trying to figure out how to best to think about the pods, at which point you start to think about pods and how you restructure it into pods. I'm sure like in your team, I've definitely seen your team grow, and you maybe have 1 or 2. And how do you think about this? How do you evaluate the when you have another pause? How do you structure them, and when you're going to change them again?
So taking a step back, the key thing for the success, at least in my opinion, my experience, is if the success of a team is based on the team being able to deliver more than the sum of its parts. So let's assume that in this situation, and again, going back to my usual mantra of you need to measure everything, and you measure velocity of every team and of every single sprint. And what we've found is teams that are super cohesive tend to, over deliver. It's not rocket science. I mean, you'll find that their velocity, it takes a while to get there. Once once you've built this team, and let's say it's a team of 5 people with 3 engineers, a QA person, a product manager, and designer, and of 6 people. It takes about probably a quarter, a dozen, 6 sprints or so to get to that point, to get to a point where everyone's really humming along. So one thing we don't want to do is disrupt that. So reorganizing pods just for the sake of doing it is, well, at least in my experience, not the right way to do it. It's more about how do we assign work to teams that are really humming along. So what we typically do is our teams are all, they're not super specialized, right? We want teams to be very knowledgeable about the entire platform and the entire code base. So anyone can pick anything up, and you basically present an initiative to that team and say, hey, look, go and make that happen. Now, of course, there are times where we may find that the teams actually get a bit too large, and then it doesn't get, the efficiency goes down. So once a team gets of 8 people or something, it really doesn't work, and then you need to break it up into 2 teams or something. But restructuring teams into pods, usually you'll see the primary reason would be when velocity starts dropping, and you can see that, right? If you have 5 teams or 3 teams or whatever, you'll see the velocity of each team, and you'll know, for example, hey, there's one team that probably requires a little bit of.
Right, I totally hear you. There's a mantra. I think I forgot who I heard it from one of my VP engineering friends saying that you can break up the work to the team, or you can break up the team to work, so that obviously depend on either this is a high functioning team, so then you kind of just give work to the team, versus if the team is expanding, so you're going to have multiple team anyway, then you can break up the work. I think the other elements about that is really around kind of like, especially for a growing company, let's say like every company start with 1 product manager, you're going to have a multiple, you're going to have a more, you're going to have a more. So at that time, there are a lot of thoughts around how do we kind of have somewhat of ownership, like using example at PayPal. we had ownership of like the risk and the checkout, and then over time those teams expand more and expand more. So in your case, when your team going through growth and then you're adding more, like let's just say you started with a 1 p.m. or you start with a 1 or 2 p.m. you're adding more PMs, how do you think about structure the ownership of the PMs? Do you say you own this product code, you own this product code, or you say you own this segment of the customer, you own it? How do you think about the structure of that?
So in the ideal scenario, and we're fortunate to be in somewhat of that type of scenario, is to have product managers own a product, soup to nuts. And what I mean by that is everything from creating the business case to then delivering the product and maintaining it. I mean, that's how that's how product people and product managers in general get satisfaction. And they're like, hey, look, I get to basically make decisions on a specific product, and I understand the market, I understand the customers, I understand what makes what are the kind of key innovations happening,
Right.
what are the challenges that are facing, what kind of headwinds and so on. So having that level and providing that level of ownership, I think, is possible to, if it's possible, that's the way to do it. But as teams grow, then you can essentially have a team own that product line, right? And then you can have, but ideally doing it by product line works much better. I think PayPal was interesting because it was a gigantic platform, so it was a slightly different approach, and the definition of product was always one under sort of, we had multiple debates around, well, what is a product? Is checkout a product? And those types of things I think lead to more complex conversations. Right. But in our situation right now, I think we're a bit more fortunate.
Right. I think it definitely I definitely think that evolution of the structure is related to what makes the most sense to deliver a set of value to your customers, a business value, regardless it's a product line or it's a segment of the product. Obviously, when you get bigger, you have to have multiple ways to slice it. And even for a small company, you have a similar thing. So that leads to one of the other questions that is the topic, which is around the stakeholders, the alignment, the juggling things, and the trade-offs. So would love to hear a little bit. Obviously, every company faces that. And then how does your team manage it, and how you keep people aligned?
So that's a lot of questions. So maybe we can start with, let's start with trade-offs and resourcing, and then we can talk maybe about alignment. Or do we want to do alignment first? I'm happy to do whichever.
Whatever naturally flow.
Okay, so maybe we could, so let me talk a little bit about managing, with the resources that we have, and how do you sort of do these trade-offs. So it again goes back to KPIs and KPIs that drive the business. So essentially investment, at least the way we approach it, is it's based on ROI for every initiative, whether it's what we call a voice of customer feature that's benefiting an existing customer, or a voice of prospect feature that's going to help us gain a new customer. We need to have a pretty clear understanding of what the impact is going to be, and then balancing that against what we think, at least at a high level, what the cost of building out that product or feature is going to look like. And the key here is, I mean, we typically, the metrics that we use is, for example, it's either new MRR, monthly recurring revenue, or retained MRR. So how much revenue is going to get retained if we retain a specific segment of customers. We typically don't do one-offs. We try to do, because it's very easy, especially in B2B SaaS, and as you start getting into B to large B, where you're getting dragged into sort of, hey, there's one feature that needs to be done. There are bug fixes that we need to address. That's a different story. But when it comes to features, we typically want to look at chunks of investment based on again, as I said, retained revenue or new MRR. And the key here is, again, and a very interesting quote years ago when I was at PayPal, I attended a course, and one of the instructors said, your opinion, although interesting, is irrelevant. So because opinions are great, but when we're building scaling products, it's more about what needs to happen for groups of customers, large segments of customers. So, and that helps us get to data-driven decision-making, and then helps us assign and allocate resources as needed. Part two, limited resources. I think that's there's no one here that could, if everyone could get their entire roadmap down, I think there's something wrong, or clearly there's an idiosyncrasy there. But essentially, when it comes to limited resources, which is a reality for all small startups, it's about categorizing and allocating investment. And the way we approach it is we allocate based on certain they have 4 key buckets. So we look at it in terms of new features, and this is what I talked about, whether it's a voice of customer, voice of prospect, or innovation. Then we have another bucket called, system reliability, which is making sure that, this is primarily things like, bug fixes and making sure that things are on track. And then there's infrastructure, and then professional services. And those buckets can vary depending on the type of company. But ultimately, the key is to be able to figure out the allocation breakdown based on stage of growth. So, and typically it biases more towards reliability and infrastructure and even professional services as the company matures. And it's less, and it's more towards, new feature investment when we're still kind of establishing product market fit. And then the other part of it is staying disciplined with it. So being disciplined about resource allocation and doing periodic look backs, and we do this on a quarterly basis, and reallocate based on investment performance. I know I sound like an investment manager at JP Morgan, but it's actually true. I hate to sound like that being a product manager, but that's very important and that's where tools like Dragonboat are very helpful, because you can do a look back and sort of say, well, I invested, this much here. This is kind of what the product adoption looked like. This is what the revenue looked like. And does this make sense? Do we need to invest further? And the periodicity, or how quickly and how often you look back, depends on, again, maturity of the company. Sometimes you need to look back once a quarter, sometimes it's once every 2 sprints, sometimes even once every sprint, depending how back you're,
Yeah, I think you touched on so many things where, thinking about, like, first of all, think about resource and scarcity. It's true, no company when we grow up professionally at PayPal, we get a couple hundred engineers, thousands of engineers. We never had enough resource. It's never enough, right? And I think the portfolio approach, it makes so much sense, because there's impossible to sift through hundreds of product ideas and features, and then even try to, how can you score things based on what? It's just like all these very interesting things of how, like, if we want to say product management is to drive outcome. And for you to drive outcome, which is not one, right? It's multiples, it's like a retentions or revenue, and all these are different. They are all important. It just have a different level of importance at a different time. So if you don't take a portfolio management approach to it, it's just not, it is investment. Product managers are like investment bankers, right? You basically say, I am deciding what our engineers to be working on, and their time is and their talents, one of the most valuable assets of the company, right? So we are indeed making investment decisions. That you're working on these things, that's the investment decision, right? That's the things that we put it into it. and then the things coming out of it is leading to that. I'm glad you know, not glad, I think, you know, savvy product leaders definitely have to take this approach. And you kind of touched upon a little bit of Dragonboat. Actually, there's a question from the audience that why did you choose Dragonboat over roadmap tools? So would love to hear a little bit more, you know, how you were thinking when you started to. Actually, I don't think even like someone else came to us and I realized, oh, actually it's you, it's your company. So it's an interesting story to learn even for me.
Yeah, so we were using another road mapping tool prior to it, and it was very much a cosmetic tool to sort of communicate the roadmap to key stakeholders. And we were realizing that I mean, ultimately, and as we all know, it's about the ability to close the loop, right? You need to be able to close the loop and sort of say, well, it's great. It's one thing just communicating a pretty Gantt chart and then keep updating that Gantt chart, but what actually drives the inputs into that Gantt chart? And that's essentially what you know, Dragonboat was. We were looking for a solution that sort of offered that. It's like, well, we have all these inputs. We want to be able to manage and track how much we want to invest and how that investment is actually doing, and then also manage, for example, things like scoring each one of our initiatives and to help us prioritize what we should do of first versus second. And then once we have all of that done and the inputs are well defined, the output, which is the Gantt chart, is relatively straightforward. That's the sort of easy part. So that was one of the primary reasons why we did this, because we really did want to be able to have a single source of truth of our initiatives. And I mean, I'm not saying by any means that it's perfect right now, but at least we have a place where, because we work with all our tactical planning happens in Jira, and we do more of our quote unquote strategic planning in Dragonboat. So, and then the interface between the two also is super useful, because we can then transpose the initiatives from Dragonboat into Jira, so that then kind of flows downstream into our sprint planning process.
Right. And I think that's like most of our team, I mean, we knew that the strategic part of the product is quite essential, really just determine, right? You could have a very high velocity team and then build everything perfectly, but if you feed the decision in there not in the best way, it's not going to drive the outcome we want, right? So I think that, you know, I think that, you know, remember at PayPal, we had this Shamana process. We spent so much time, so much spreadsheets, and ultimately, but you know, that we did, it was tough to have those conversations, to debate on, well, where we should invest. But it's just so important to have that conversation and difficult discussions up front and early on. So that would really determine the direction we want to go. So, and that really helped. I mean, looking back to think how amazing PayPal has become, from a single product to multi-product to multi-product to portfolio of portfolios. And this, the thought process, and as painful as it is to operationalize it, is in essence really the foundation drive it, I think.
Absolutely. And I think, and it kind of relates to one of the other questions I'm just looking at that came through, is like, you know, how do you keep all the teams aligned as they grow, and how do you manage who communicates what and when? And this is exactly it, right? So as the teams grow, that is exactly the sort of secret sauce, because as the one thing that happens as teams grow, and this is, I remember us having these conversations the early days of PayPal, is we were just spending a lot of times in meetings just communicating with people about, hey, this is what I'm doing, and what are you working on? And then, well, maybe we should collaborate here, and maybe we should solve this. And it was very organic, and I think we've evolved a lot since then, right? With the advent of multiple tools, and also again, to use the word process, where what we typically do is, and we're small enough to be able to get away with it. I think I don't know the person who asked the question, how large the company is, but the most important thing I think is first, of course, is building a culture of collaboration throughout the product lifecycle. So from ideation through research to design, implementation, launch, and growth. That's part one. And then consistent communication, and this is across the board, right? Not just internally, but with the customers, with the board members, execs, and development teams, so that everyone's aligned and everyone's aware of what's happening and coming down the pipeline. By no means are we perfect, but we attempt to do that because I think it's important to know, everyone marching to the sort of same drumbeat, and that's important. And this is kind of where good product management helps, and product can play the role of what I call a servant leader, because product managers are not necessarily kind of the drivers. Ultimately, it's, yes, we're driving the execution and sometimes product strategy, but product also plays a huge amount in making sure everyone is aligned and everyone's aware of what's happening. Whether that means setting up product review meetings. For example, what we leverage is we have product review meetings across the board, whether it's with our cross-functional teams or design review meetings with our cross-functional teams, with our customer success managers, with our executive team. We also then have meetings and or well-documented product briefs that are shared broadly. Right. We want to share the product brief, and everyone has a chance to comment on the product brief. And we use Confluence to sort of write out the product briefs, not giant essays, but hey, here's kind of what we're trying to do, and here's what we're trying to launch. Our designers spend a lot of time, communicating what it is that we want to build with the engineering team and with the cross-functional team. So doing this on a consistent basis. And this is kind of where the product manager helps, right? Having these conversations and driving these conversations with the stakeholders to make sure that people are getting the information that they need. Now, how do you know whether is it too many meetings or not enough? That's a tougher question because it depends on the company culture. There are some companies that are very meeting oriented. And there are other companies that people love to read. They'll just go, you know what, just all I have to do is upload my document or my product brief and send out a Slack message and say, send your comments, and people will just comment on documents and it'll work. In other situations, no, we have to bring a team together and do a review. And for example, at PayPal, we had to do more meetings. At Chatmeter, it's more meeting heavy. So we do spend a lot more time on that. It depends on the culture.
Yeah, I totally, I definitely observed quite of those behaviors as well. I think what I've also noticed that especially with the remote and distributed different teams, it's going to be a hybrid multi-channel approach, right? So you will have a system of information, right? We call it source to choose or whatnot, so that people can read it, they can comment it, but then you also have a live synchronized moment where you can kind of have a conversation, talk about it, so that people will only cover things they want to talk about more. And the other one's just like you already know, you have information there. So that's like the asynchronized with a tool or sort of the information access method, plus the live session seems to be the more norm these days.
Yeah, and I think one thing I would also caution, I think, is that with people, more and more companies being remote only or remote first, it does become, you end up with this, Zoom fatigue is real, right? So I think there needs to be good balance around this, because while Zoom fatigue is real, it's also hard to keep people engaged when everyone's just remote and sitting in front of their terminals all day or in front of their computers all day. So it's about finding that balance and being able to engage the group virtually. And there's some nice tools that allow for it. We use a tool called, for example, Miro. It's like online whiteboarding, and I know there are customers of yours too. So it's pretty cool because we could it helps with the conversation, especially with synchronous conversations, and even asynchronous to an extent.
Right, definitely true. So I think there's another question around product operations. Do you have product operations, and how, what do you think about their roles if you have one? I think you probably do, but I just want to.
We don't well, I mean, we have product operations is kind of big and gray area. So we have sales operations and we have product analytics, which I think together probably would be. So it depends on the type of company. Again, for us, most of the operational roles in product are around analytics. So we have product analysts and business analysts, and then on the sales ops side, same thing, right? We have data analysts who kind of look at this data, and it's a very important part of the company, especially for someone like us who's very data centric and data driven in our decision making, and the team's really responsible for making sure that everything that we do can be measured, right, and can be instrumented and can be made visible. So a significant amount of time is spent, we spend a lot of time building dashboards, internal dashboards that, we call it data wrangling essentially, because there aren't perfect tools out there to be able to wrangle data from multiple different data sources. And what I mean by that is, so we have, click data that comes in from the front end, collect, at the web layer. And we have tools like, Mixpanel that collect that data. And then we have event data that's logged in the database. And then we have our, customer data logged in our CRM system, like Salesforce, and then we have billing data in our billing system. So we need to be able to pull all of this together to really get a 360 view of what we call our customer journey dashboard. And this is sort of where product analytics comes in, and product ops. We're not big enough yet to have a full-on product ops team. We're primarily focused on product analytics, but our sales ops team does a lot of work on, gathering the front end of that data, especially with Salesforce.
Right. So, I in many ways, a lot of companies kind of like have the product playing that role, right? So you're wearing multiple hats, both as a running product, running team. You're also running your own product ops in some ways, right?
Yeah, I think right now we're not at a point where we have like gigantic teams. So we run fairly nimble, and it's when I say teams, it's teams of 1, 2, or 3 people, right? It's not like teams of dozens of people. So
right. I want to touch upon one like a last topic, and then I think anyone that has questions, please do also just submit as well. One of the things that you touched upon a little bit earlier around KPIs and goals and MRRs, and I think those are great in terms of more measurable, more relatively near term, right? Midterm sort of the focus. How do you balance that near-term value and the goal that we get quite often from a business to the long-term product strategy and the vision? How do you typically think about this and incorporate into your organization?
It's a tough one. So for us, we usually plan out at least. I mean, we plan out about a year ahead, right? And we're not looking decades ahead or 5 years ahead. We're looking to a year ahead, and that's sort of our quote unquote long-term strategy. And what we typically do though is, and in order for us to be successful, since we're small and we're also limited resources, so we break our long-term strategy into shorter term tactical deliverables so that there's not a disconnect between the two. So we're not like So for example, let's say, hey, 2 years ago, but yeah, 2 years ago, if we sort of said, hey, we really wanted to start winning in social, right? We wanted to, and we start building our MVP of our product like about 18 months ago, and the product's been on the market since then. And we have been slowly iterating on that. And the thing about the way we and the situation we're in is it's you build, you sort of test and iterate and launch. It may be an MVP or slightly less than MVP, slightly more than MVP. And then because our customers are enterprise customers, we usually need to wait a few months to get that feedback. So we'll get that feedback, and then it'll help us inform our roadmap 3-6 months down the road, right? So that's typically how we do it, and it takes us. So we kind of know what that end goal is, and we also know, for example, the other thing from a longer-term strategy standpoint is, well, where do we want to set the benchmark? Do we want to win? Do we want to get to parity? Or do we just want to scratch the surface? And it's important to sort of lay out, because we're in a pretty competitive space and can't win in everything. So we sort of say, okay, well, there are certain areas we know we can win, like application management. And there are other areas where we need to be competitive, but we don't necessarily have to win. And then there are others where we need to check the box. So, and that's the sort of trade-offs that we make. And we sort of say, okay, well, that's how we're going to allocate investment. And some may take 24 months to get to, some may take 6, and some might, or in somewhere in between.
Right. It is there's a couple of things that just jumps out. It's so interesting where a lot of times people think about strategy either as a product manager figured out like such a big words, or from some of the product executives feel like it's just like a vision. There's not much to think about it. The strategy is the vision operationalized into actual the execution, right? And I think the way you think about it is like, if I were to paraphrase, is that most company at a certain size, looking at a year, so probably is a long term, right? It's the way to work, the word we're in. And then really the way you think about long-term strategy really is to say, reflecting the understanding of the market and competition. Like that's sort of like a number one, what is driving strategy? It's looking out like from now to, a year in, what would our market look like, where our competition would look like, and try to figure, and then really trying to make sure we don't get behind. Because if we look at a quarter over a quarter, then we would just say, oh wow, the whole world has changed and we're completely left behind. So the long-term strategy really is to see the period of the time away from our day-to-day in the industry where we are, that's lying now for a year or so, so it probably makes sense. And then the focus is on the market and competition, what could it mean for us? So that's like something I think is great. Like just strategy is just not an empty term. People threw this word so much out there, it becomes just not useful, but it's really, really important to have to look up to say where we could be and then where our threats are. The second part I really, it's so cool that you said that's exactly how we think about that as well, is to sort of like, is to win, is the checkbox, or it is just not become a no, right? People won't turn you down because you don't have it. You won't win, but you're gonna have to have that, right? Sort of the hygiene feature. I think these 3 categories so funny, because I remember we had one of the strategic sessions with the Brent Baum. So do you remember Brent used to lead PayPal Europe, and he's still is the CEO at BigCommerce. One of the first session we did, he joined, was like exactly going through the 3 categories of things, of sort of the winning, the differentiators, the checkbox versus the hygiene which you have to do. It's really cool to hear you say exactly the same kind of the categories of things. And I think that's so essential for product teams to think about what is our bet, right? Those are the differentiators. What are our initiatives, which is to translate our strategy and the focus to stay somewhat alive and competitive, and then what are just the features and epics, those other things that kind of really deliver to features, right? So I think having that kind of thought process is so critical to just move the product organization forward, right?
Yeah, and it's not easy to, I mean, it sounds easy, but I think the hardest part, people always say, hey, we'll go from strategy to tactics. It's actually, that's where the real work is. So
Right.
it's easy to sort of just say, hey, we want to build this cool stuff. And then, but the hard part is, well, A, will it be cool enough? Will it make you money? Will it drive usage? Or is it just going to be a vanity feature, right? So
Right. Vanity feature, exactly. Well, it's so fun to talk to you about scaling product. We covered quite a few topics, and I'm going to just, a couple of screenshots if anyone want to see about Dragonboat. I want to just go down to the last screen, which is additional resources. So I'm Becky, coming from Dragonboat. We're the responsive product portfolio management platform, and Sridhar from Chatmeter, and as a head of the product and then location experts. And I think all of us are growing, which is good news, and it also means we have lots of opportunities for you as well. You can find more information about both companies, and also if you're interested in joining Chatmeter or Dragonboat, you can find us where we are.
Awesome. Thank you so much for the invitation, Becky and Baji. And yeah, it was a wonderful conversation. Loved it, and look forward to more of these. And congrats again for your.
Thank you very much, Sridhar.
Thank you both, and thank you everybody for joining.